So black soldier make children this way during war. Can I try too? Said the Japanese prison of war. August 14th, 1945. 0700 hours. Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The transport truck lurched to a stop, throwing Private First Class Takeo Nishida forward against the wooden bench. Through the canvas flap, he could see guard towers rising against the morning sky, their searchlights dark in the daylight. His hands, bound with rope that seemed unnecessarily loose, trembled not from fear but from the crushing weight of shame. Capture meant dishonor. Capture meant he had failed his emperor, his family, his ancestors stretching back 1,000 years. The Imperial Japanese Army had taught him everything about dying with honor. They had taught him nothing about living without it. 23 days earlier, Takeo had been fighting on Okinawa when American artillery had turned his position into hell on earth. The bombardment consumed more shells in 1 hour than his entire regiment had fired in 6 months. When the smoke cleared, he found himself alone among the dead, his rifle destroyed, his leg broken, and American Marines advancing through the rubble. He had reached for his grenade, prepared to take as many enemies with him as possible, when pain and blood loss pulled him into unconsciousness. He woke in an American field hospital, his leg splinted, an intravenous line feeding glucose into his arm. The American medic, a young man who looked barely 20, had smiled at him and said something in English. Takeo understood none of it, but he understood the chocolate bar the medic pressed into his hand, the first food he had eaten in 2 days. Now, as armed guards opened the truck's rear gate, Takeo steeled himself for what came next. The propaganda films shown in training had been explicit. American soldiers tortured prisoners. They cut off fingers, pulled out teeth, burned men alive for entertainment. The officers had shown photographs, though now Takeo wondered if those images had been real or manufactured. Everything he had been told about the war was collapsing like wet paper. "Out," one guard said, his rifle pointed at the ground rather than at the prisoners. Takeo climbed down awkwardly, his splinted leg making movement difficult. 16 other Japanese soldiers descended behind him, their faces masks of resignation. They expected bullets. They expected bayonets. They expected the cruelty that seemed natural between enemies who had been killing each other for 4 years. Instead, they got Sergeant Harold Watkins. The American sergeant, a thick-necked man from Tennessee whose drawl Takeo would later learn to recognize, approached with a clipboard and what looked like genuine concern on his face. He spoke to an interpreter, a Japanese-American soldier whose presence confused Takeo even more. How could a man of Japanese blood fight for America? "Tell them they're safe," Sergeant Watkins said through the interpreter. "Tell them. We follow the Geneva Convention. They'll be fed, housed, and treated according to international law. Tell them nobody's going to hurt them." The interpreter translated, and Takeo heard several prisoners behind him exhale breaths they had been holding since capture. But Takeo remained skeptical. This kindness was a trick, a softening before the inevitable cruelty. Americans were masters of deception. Everyone knew this. The guards formed them into a line and marched them toward a processing building. Takeo expected the march to be brutal, but the pace was slow, accommodating his injured leg. When he stumbled, a guard steadied him with a hand on his elbow. The gesture shocked him more than a blow would have. Inside the processing building, the cognitive dissonance intensified. They were photographed, given identification numbers, and issued clean clothing. A doctor examined each man, treating injuries with careful attention. Takeo's leg splint was replaced with a proper cast. The doctor, a gray-haired man with gentle hands, worked without speaking, but his expression held no hatred, no contempt, only professional concentration. The transformation from soldier to prisoner took 90 minutes. In that time, nothing Takeo had been taught proved true. No torture, no starvation, no humiliation beyond the inherent shame of capture itself. As guards escorted him to the prisoner barracks, Takeo felt the first crack in his certainty about who the enemy really was. Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now, back to the story. August 15th, 1945, 1300 hours. Barracks 7, Camp McCoy. Takeo sat on his assigned bunk, staring at the steel tray before him. The lunch ration defied comprehension. White bread. Actual white bread, not the mixture of sawdust and rice flour that had sustained Japanese troops for the past year. Beef stew with visible chunks of meat. Mashed potatoes with butter. An apple. Coffee with sugar. He had not seen such food since before the war began. Around him, fellow prisoners ate in silence, their chopsticks moving mechanically as they processed this abundance. Across the barracks, Private Hiroshi Tanaka, captured 3 months earlier at Iwo Jima, noticed Takeo's hesitation. "The food is not poisoned," Hiroshi said quietly in Japanese. "I thought the same thing when I arrived. We all did. But it's real. This is what they eat. This is their normal food." Takeo wanted to argue, to maintain his skepticism, but hunger overrode ideology. He ate. The beef was tender, seasoned with herbs he couldn't identify. The bread was soft, nothing like the rock-hard biscuits that had broken his teeth during the Okinawa campaign. When he finished, his stomach felt uncomfortably full, a sensation he had almost forgotten existed. "How is this possible?" Takeo whispered to Hiroshi. "Japan is starving. Our soldiers were eating grass on Okinawa. How can the Americans feed prisoners like this?" Hiroshi shrugged, a gesture he had picked up from the American guards. "Because they have everything. I've been here 93 days. Every day, 3 meals. Every day, more food than we need. I've gained 14 pounds. My uniform from capture doesn't fit anymore." The mathematics were impossible. Japan had mobilized its entire economy for war. Every resource, every calorie, every gram of metal went to the military. Citizens accepted starvation as patriotic duty. Yet here, prisoners of war ate better than Japanese generals. Through the barracks window, Takeo watched American soldiers outside. They moved without the rigid discipline of Japanese troops, laughing, smoking cigarettes they seemed to have in unlimited supply. One soldier was throwing a baseball to another, as if they were at a picnic rather than guarding enemy prisoners. The casual abundance of their movements, the waste of energy on play, spoke to resources beyond imagination. A guard entered the barracks, a young corporal who couldn't have been older than 22. "Any of you speak English?" he asked. When no one responded, he tried hand gestures. "Doctor. Sick. Anyone sick?" Takeo understood. The Americans were checking on their health. He pointed to an older prisoner in the corner who had been coughing since arrival. The guard approached carefully, non-threateningly, and gestured for the sick man to follow him to the infirmary. "They do this every day," Hiroshi explained after the guard left. "Check for illness, provide medicine. Last month I had a tooth infection. The camp dentist pulled the tooth and gave me pills for pain. American medicine, strong medicine. The pain stopped in 2 days." That night, lying on his bunk with its actual mattress and clean sheets,
Takeo confronted the growing crack in his worldview. Everything he had been told about American brutality was proving false. Everything he had believed about American weakness was revealing itself as propaganda. The enemy he had been taught to hate showed more humanity than his own commanders ever had. In the darkness, another prisoner spoke softly. "Do you think we were lied to about everything? About the war? About why we were fighting?" No one answered, but Takeo knew they were all thinking the same thing. The silence in the barracks was not peaceful. It was the silence of men whose certainties were dissolving, whose identities as loyal soldiers of the emperor were transforming into something they didn't yet understand. Outside, an American guard walked past the window, whistling a tune Takeo didn't recognize. The sound was casual, carefree, the sound of a man who knew he was on the winning side of history and could afford to be generous. Takeo closed his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he saw not the propaganda images of American devils, but the gentle hands of the doctor who had reset his leg, the smile of the medic who had given him chocolate, the
guard who had steadied him when he stumbled. The enemy was supposed to be easy to hate, but nothing about this was easy anymore. August 17th, 1945, 1400 hours. Camp McCoy Recreation Yard. The August sun beat down on the packed earth where Japanese prisoners sat in small groups, some reading American newspapers through interpreters, others playing simple games with stones and sticks. Takeo had been assigned to a work detail in the camp kitchen, peeling potatoes under the supervision of a black American soldier whose name tag read Carter. Sergeant James Carter was not what Takeo expected. The Imperial Japanese Army's training had included explicit warnings about black American soldiers. They were described as savages, barely human, driven by primitive instincts. The propaganda photos showed exaggerated features, animal-like expressions. But Sergeant Carter, standing in the kitchen doorway with his sleeves rolled up, looked nothing like those images. He was tall, yes, muscular from years of physical labor, but his face showed intelligence, humor, and a kind of patient weariness that Takeo recognized from his own father's eyes. "Keep peeling," Carter said through the interpreter, a Japanese-American corporal named Takeshi Yamamoto. "We got 500 men to feed tonight. These potatoes ain't gonna peel themselves." Takeo worked methodically, his hands learning the rhythm of the vegetable peeler. Around him, 6 other Japanese prisoners performed similar tasks. The kitchen was clean, organized, filled with equipment Takeo had never seen before. Industrial refrigerators hummed in the corner. Electric stoves lined one wall. The abundance of tools, of space, of food reinforced everything he was learning about American capacity. Corporal Yamamoto, whose presence still confused Takeo, moved between prisoners, translating Carter's instructions. During a break, when Carter stepped outside to smoke, Takeo gathered courage to ask Yamamoto the question that had been burning in his mind. "How can you wear their uniform? How can you fight for America against Japan?" Yamamoto's expression hardened. "Because I am American. My parents were born in Japan, but I was born in California. This is my country, even though my country put my family in a camp before I could join the army." The revelation stunned Takeo. Americans imprisoned their own Japanese citizens? The complexity of it overwhelmed his ability to process. Everything was contradictions. Americans imprisoned Japanese families, but treated Japanese soldiers with unexpected humanity. Americans preached freedom, but practiced discrimination. Americans were the enemy, but showed more kindness than his own officers ever had. Carter returned, and the work resumed. But then, through the open kitchen door,
Takeo heard voices from the adjacent mess hall. American soldiers were eating lunch, their conversation drifting into the kitchen. One voice, younger and excited, was talking about his wife.
"She's 8 months along now," the voice said. "My mama sent a picture. You can really see the belly now. Doc says any day now." Another voice, deeper, responded. "My youngest just turned 4. Wife sends pictures every week. Kid's growing like a weed." Then Carter's voice joined the conversation. "My Louise is expecting in November. Gonna be our 3rd. 2 boys already. Hoping for a girl this time." The casual domesticity of the conversation paralyzed Takeo's hands. These men, these soldiers, these enemies, were fathers. They had wives who were pregnant, children who were growing, families who sent pictures. They were not the inhuman monsters of propaganda. They were men who wanted to go home. Takeo's question came without conscious thought, spoken in Japanese to Yamamoto, but loud enough that Carter turned to listen to the translation. "So, black soldier make children this way during war? Can I try too?" The kitchen fell silent. Yamamoto's eyes widened, uncertain how to translate such an innocent yet profound question. The other prisoners stopped working, sensing the weight of the moment. Carter stared at Takeo, then slowly began to smile. Not a mocking smile, but one of understanding. Through Yamamoto, Carter responded. "Son, black soldiers make children the same way every other man does. With love, with hope, with prayers that they'll live to see them grow up. And yes, you can try too. Someday, when this war is over, you can go home and have a family. You can have children. You can have a normal life." The translation hit Takeo like physical force. The propaganda had never mentioned this, that the enemy believed Japanese soldiers deserved futures, that they saw prisoners not as subhumans to be destroyed, but as men who might one day return to normal lives, have families, grow old. Tears blurred Takeo's vision. He bent over the potatoes, hands shaking, as the first real crack in his ideological armor split wide open. Carter placed a hand on Takeo's shoulder, gentle, fatherly. "It's all right, son. War's almost over anyway. Emperor's supposed to announce surrender any day now. Then you can all go home." The words meant nothing to Takeo in that moment. His mind was reeling from a simpler, more devastating truth. The enemy saw him as human. The enemy believed he deserved a future. The enemy, despite everything, showed him more compassion than his own government ever had. August 19th, 1945, 0900 hours. Camp McCoy, 1 day after Japan's surrender. The news had arrived through official channels, then spread through the camp like wildfire. Emperor Hirohito had surrendered. The war was over. Japan had lost. Takeo sat in Barracks 7, surrounded by men who should have been celebrating the end of 4 years of killing. Instead, silence hung heavy as morning fog. Some prisoners wept quietly. Others stared at nothing, their faces blank with shock. A few had attempted ritual suicide during the night, stopped by guards who seemed to expect such reactions and had watched carefully. The shame was supposed to be overwhelming. Surrender meant dishonor. Surrender meant they could never return home, never face their families, never look their ancestors in the eye. The code of Bushido demanded death before capture. Yet here they sat, alive, well-fed, treated with unexpected decency by an enemy who had no obligation to show mercy. Hiroshi approached Takeo's bunk, his face drawn but thoughtful. He had been awake all night, struggling with the same questions that plagued them all. "I heard Sergeant Watkins talking to the interpreter," Hiroshi said quietly. "They're preparing to send us home. Not immediately, but eventually. They're going to repatriate us." "Home to what?" Takeo asked bitterly. "Our cities are destroyed, our families are starving, and we are men without honor. Prisoners who failed to die for the Emperor." "The Emperor himself surrendered," Hiroshi countered. "If the Emperor can surrender, if the Emperor can choose life over death for the nation, then perhaps our survival is not the disgrace we were taught to believe." The logic was seductive, dangerous. It undermined everything their training had instilled. But it also offered a path forward, a way to reconcile survival with identity. Through the barracks window, Takeo watched American soldiers going about their morning routines. They didn't look like conquerors drunk on victory. They looked tired, relieved, ready to go home. One soldier was reading a letter, tears streaming down his face. Good news or bad, Takeo couldn't tell, but the emotion was raw and real. Private George Miller, the cook who supervised kitchen detail, entered the barracks with Corporal Yamamoto. Miller was a squat man from Iowa, 42 years old, with a farmer's hands and a gentle demeanor that seemed ill-suited to war. "Breakfast in 20 minutes, Yamamoto translated. "After that, Sergeant Watkins wants to talk to everyone about what happens next." As prisoners filed toward the mess hall, Takeo noticed the food quality hadn't changed despite Japan's surrender. The same abundance, the same careful preparation. If anything, the portions seemed larger. At the serving line, Miller personally handed Takeo a tray loaded with scrambled eggs, bacon, toast, and coffee. "Heard about your question the other day," Miller said through Yamamoto. "About having children. That took courage, asking something so personal. Shows you're thinking about the future. That's good. That's healthy." Takeo accepted the tray, overwhelmed by the kindness in Miller's eyes. "I didn't mean to offend." "Offend?" Miller laughed. "Son, you reminded us why we're fighting. Not to kill, but to get home to our families, to build lives, to have futures. You reminded us you want the same thing. That makes you human, not enemy." After breakfast, Sergeant Watkins assembled all prisoners in the recreation yard. Through interpreters, he delivered news that should have terrified them, but somehow didn't. "The war is over. Japan has surrendered. Under the terms of surrender, all prisoners of war will be repatriated to Japan once transportation can be arranged. This may take months. Until then, you will remain here, under the same conditions you've experienced. You will be fed, housed, and treated according to international law. Those of you who wish to work will continue receiving wages. Those who prefer not to work may remain in the barracks." A prisoner near Takeo raised his hand. Through the interpreter, he asked, "What will happen to us when we return to Japan?" Watkins' expression softened. "That's between you and your government. But I'll tell you what I know. General MacArthur is overseeing the occupation. His orders are to treat Japanese civilians with fairness and help rebuild the country. You're going home to a different Japan than the one you left. Whether that's better or worse, time will tell." The assembly dispersed, men drifting back to barracks in small groups, processing this information. Takeo found himself walking alongside Hiroshi and two other prisoners toward the fence line, where they could see beyond the camp to the Wisconsin countryside. "Do you think they're telling the truth?" one prisoner asked. "About helping rebuild Japan?" "They feed us better than our own army did," Hiroshi observed. "They give us medicine when we're sick." They didn't execute us after surrender. Why would they lie now? Takeo watched an American farmer in the distance, driving a tractor across a field. The machine moved steadily, efficiently, turning soil without animals, without human muscle. Just gasoline and engineering. The abundance extended beyond the military, beyond the camp, into everyday life. We were taught America was weak, Takeo said slowly. Divided by race, softened by luxury, incapable of sacrifice. But they have black soldiers who serve alongside white soldiers. They have Japanese Americans who fight for a country that imprisoned their families. They have abundance beyond our imagination, yet they still ration themselves to feed us, their prisoners. Everything we were taught was a lie. The words hung in the air, seditious, dangerous, true. That evening, assigned again to kitchen detail, Takeo worked alongside Miller in comfortable silence, peeling vegetables for dinner. The work was meditative, giving his hands something to do while his mind grappled with impossible questions. When Miller stepped outside for a cigarette break, he invited Takeo to join him, offering a smoke. Takeo declined the cigarette but accepted the invitation, standing in the evening air beside his former enemy. Miller talked about his farm in Iowa, his wife and 3 children, his plans after discharge. He spoke of planting corn, raising hogs, maybe getting a new tractor like the one he'd seen in a Sears catalog. Simple dreams. Attainable dreams. The kind of future Takeo had stopped imagining was possible. "What about you?" Miller asked through Yamamoto, who had followed them outside. "What do you want to do after you go home?" The question struck Takeo as absurd. What did he want? The concept of personal desire, divorced from duty to emperor and nation, felt foreign. But Miller's expression showed genuine interest, not mockery. "I don't know," Takeo admitted. "Before the war, I worked in my father's shop. We made furniture. Beautiful furniture from good wood. But that was a different life, a different person." "Skills don't disappear," Miller said. "World's gonna need furniture after this war. Lots of folks rebuilding homes, starting families. Man who can work with his hands will always find work." The idea planted itself in Takeo's mind, fragile but growing. A future. Not glory, not honor in the traditional sense, but a life. Work, maybe a family. A purpose beyond dying for an emperor who had surrendered anyway. As darkness fell and they returned to the kitchen to finish dinner preparation, Takeo felt the weight of his transformation. He was no longer the soldier who had arrived 10 days earlier, prepared to die rather than accept kindness from the enemy. He was becoming something new, something he didn't yet have words for. A survivor, perhaps. Or simply a man who had learned that the enemy's face looked remarkably like his own. August 22nd, 1945, 1500 hours. Camp McCoy work detail. The afternoon sun beat down on the fence repair crew, a mixed group of Japanese prisoners and American guards working to replace a section damaged during a recent storm. Takeo had volunteered for the detail, needing physical work to quiet the questions churning in his mind. Private Jacob Hill, a 19-year-old from Kentucky, worked alongside the prisoners, showing them how to string barbed wire properly. His instructions came through Corporal Yamamoto, but Hill's demonstrations made words unnecessary. He was patient, good-natured, the kind of young man who would have been a friend in another life. The work progressed smoothly until Hill's wire cutters slipped, slicing deep into his forearm. Blood spurted from the wound, arterial and urgent. Hill staggered, face going pale as blood soaked his sleeve. "Medic!" one guard shouted, running toward the main camp. But the infirmary was 300 yards away, and Hill was losing blood fast. He dropped to his knees, trying to apply pressure but fumbling, going into shock. Takeo didn't think. He moved. Years of field training took over. He dropped his tools, grabbed Hill's arm, and pressed his thumb directly on the pressure point above the wound. With his free hand, he ripped fabric from his own shirt, fashioning a tourniquet, while barking instructions in Japanese that Yamamoto frantically translated. "Elevate the arm. Someone get me clean cloth. Keep him conscious. Talk to him." Other prisoners hesitated, uncertain, but Hiroshi responded immediately, helping elevate Hill's arm while another prisoner produced a relatively clean undershirt. Takeo wrapped the wound tightly, applied the tourniquet, and kept pressure on the artery until Hill's blood flow slowed to a manageable seep. By the time the medic arrived with his kit, Hill was stable, conscious, and staring at Takeo with a mixture of shock and gratitude. The medic, a veteran corpsman named Rodriguez, assessed the situation quickly. "Who did the first aid?" Rodriguez asked. "The prisoner," a guard replied, pointing at Takeo. "He moved faster than any of us." Rodriguez examined Takeo's work with professional appreciation. "Clean tourniquet, good pressure point control. You probably saved his life. Where'd you learn field medicine?" Through Yamamoto, Takeo explained. "Basic training. Every Japanese soldier learns to treat combat wounds. We expected to die in battle, but we learned to keep each other alive long enough to fight again." As Rodriguez worked, finishing the bandaging and preparing Hill for transport to the infirmary, Takeo became aware of the other guards watching him. Their expressions were complex, unreadable. He had violated some unspoken boundary by helping an American soldier. But he couldn't regret it. In that moment, Hill wasn't an enemy. He was just a young man bleeding to death, and Takeo had the skills to help. Hill, stabilized and lucid, looked directly at Takeo. "Thank you," he said in English, then repeated it in badly pronounced Japanese. "Arigato." Takeo nodded, unable to speak past the emotion clogging his throat. But the consequences came swiftly. That evening, Sergeant Watkins called Takeo to the camp commander's office. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Morrison, a career officer with 30 years of service, sat behind his desk studying Takeo's file. The interpreter, Yamamoto, stood at attention beside him. "Private Nishida," Morrison began through Yamamoto, "you're aware that fraternization between prisoners and American personnel is discouraged. You're aware that you should have waited for American medics to handle the situation." "Yes, sir," Takeo replied through the interpreter. "You're also aware that Private Hill would likely be dead if you had waited those additional minutes for the medic to arrive from the infirmary." Takeo remained silent, uncertain where this was leading. Morrison's expression softened slightly. "The rules exist for good reasons. Maintaining discipline, preventing incidents, ensuring clear boundaries between prisoners and guards. But the rules also assume that prisoners are enemies who can't be trusted. Your actions today complicate that assumption." He paused, studying Takeo with eyes that had seen too much war. "Private Hill's father is a colonel serving in the Philippines. I had the unpleasant task of preparing a telegram to inform him his son had been injured. Instead, I get to tell him his son is alive because a Japanese prisoner of war saved his life. Do you understand what that means?" "No, sir," Takeo admitted. "It means the war is over, but the peace is just beginning. It means that men like you and Private Hill will have to figure out how to live in the same world. It means that maybe, just maybe, we can build something better than what we destroyed. Morrison stood, walked around his desk, and did something that shocked everyone in the room. He extended his hand to Takeo. "Thank you, Private Nishida, for reminding us that humanity transcends uniforms." Through Yamamoto, Takeo understood the gesture. In Japanese culture, bowing showed respect. In American culture, a handshake signified equality, respect between peers. He took Morrison's hand, shook it awkwardly, and felt another piece of his old identity crumble away. Back in the barracks that night, the other prisoners were divided. Some praised Takeo's actions, others muttered about collaboration, about forgetting honor, about becoming too comfortable with the enemy. One older prisoner, a veteran of campaigns in China and the Philippines, confronted him directly. "You saved an American soldier," the veteran hissed. "You chose their life over your loyalty to Japan. You've become their dog." Hiroshi stepped between them. "He saved a human being who was bleeding to death. If that makes him a dog, then I hope to become one too." The confrontation nearly escalated to violence, stopped only when Sergeant Carter appeared in the barracks doorway. His presence, calm but authoritative, silenced the argument. Through Yamamoto, he addressed the entire barracks. What happened today was not collaboration. It was compassion. Private Hill is alive because Private Nishida remembered his medical training and acted without hesitation. That doesn't make Nishida a traitor to Japan. It makes him a decent human being. Any man here who wouldn't have done the same thing needs to examine his conscience. After Carter left, the barracks remained quiet, men lost in their own thoughts. Takeo lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, replaying the day's events. He had crossed a line today, moved from passive acceptance of American kindness to active participation in their world. He had saved an enemy soldier's life, not because he was ordered to, not because he expected reward, but because it was the right thing to do. The realization terrified him. If helping Hill was right, then everything he had been taught about the enemy was wrong. If American soldiers deserved to live, deserved to be saved, then the entire war had been based on lies. The propaganda, the training, the ideology that had defined his entire adult life, all of it was collapsing like a house built on sand. Outside, an American guard made his rounds, footsteps crunching on gravel. Through the window, Takeo could see stars emerging in the darkening sky, the same stars that shone over Japan, over his family, over a world that had been torn apart by war and was now, somehow, beginning to heal. He had arrived at this camp expecting death. Instead, he was discovering life. And that discovery, more than any battlefield wound, was changing him in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. The question Sergeant Carter had asked days ago echoed in his mind. What kind of future did he want? For the first time since his capture, Takeo began to believe that answering that question might actually be possible. August 23, 1945. 0600 hours. Camp McCoy Administrative Building. Takeo stood at attention before Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's desk, uncertain what punishment awaited him for yesterday's actions. The morning sun streamed through windows, illuminating dust motes that drifted like memories of the previous day's confrontation in the barracks. Morrison studied him for a long moment before speaking through Corporal Yamamoto. "I've received 3 reports about your actions yesterday. One from Sergeant Carter, one from Private Hill's commanding officer, and one from the medical officer. All 3 say the same thing. You saved a soldier's life." Takeo remained silent, awaiting judgment. I've also received a complaint from one of your fellow prisoners. Claims you're collaborating with the enemy, that you've forgotten your duty to the Emperor. Morrison leaned back in his chair. What do you say to that? Through Yamamoto, Takeo responded carefully. I did what any soldier would do when seeing another soldier bleeding to death. Japanese training teaches us to preserve life until the fight is over. The war ended 3 days ago. There is no more fighting. Morrison nodded slowly. That's a convenient interpretation. But it raises a question. If the war is over, what are you now? Not a soldier anymore. Not quite a civilian. Something in between. The colonel stood and walked to the window overlooking the camp. The Geneva Convention requires us to treat prisoners humanely. It doesn't require us to understand you, to like you, or to trust you. But yesterday, you earned something we can't give through regulations. Respect. He turned back to Takeo. Private Hill asked to see you. He's in the infirmary recovering. I'm granting his request. Corporal Yamamoto will escort you. This conversation is over. The walk to the infirmary took 5 minutes across the campgrounds. Prisoners were being formed up for breakfast, their movements showing the lethargy of men without purpose. The war had ended, but their captivity continued. They existed in limbo, neither soldiers nor free men. Hill occupied a bed near the window, his bandaged arm elevated. He was reading a letter when Takeo entered, his young face breaking into a genuine smile at the sight of his visitor. Hey, Hill said through Yamamoto. They told me you probably saved my life. Medics said I would have bled out before he got there if you hadn't stopped the bleeding. Takeo bowed slightly, uncomfortable with gratitude. Any soldier would have done the same. Not any soldier, Hill corrected. Lots of guys would have watched me bleed, figured one less enemy to worry about. You didn't think that way. Why? The question forced Takeo to examine his own motivations. When I saw the blood, I didn't see an American soldier. I saw a young man who was going to die. My hands moved before my mind could stop them. Hill nodded thoughtfully. My pa's a colonel. He's been fighting in the Philippines since '42. Sent me a letter last month before I got this assignment. Said something I didn't understand then, but I think I do now. He held up the worn letter. He said, the hardest part of war isn't killing the enemy. It's remembering they're human. Said the day you forget that, you lose something you can never get back. Hill looked directly at Takeo. You remembered. That took courage. Through the window, Takeo could see other prisoners moving toward the mess hall. Among them was the veteran who had accused him of collaboration, walking with 3 others who shared his rigid view of honor and shame. The division among the prisoners was growing, those who accepted their new reality and those who clung desperately to the old certainties. What happens now? Takeo asked. The war is over, but we are still here. You are still injured. Nothing has changed except we no longer have to kill each other. Hill laughed, wincing as the movement pulled at his stitches. Everything's changed. You saved an enemy soldier. I'm grateful to a Japanese prisoner. My pa's gonna read my letter about this and probably think I'm crazy. He paused. But maybe crazy is what we need. Too much sanity got us into this war. Before Takeo could respond, a nurse entered to check Hill's bandages. She worked efficiently, professionally, ignoring Takeo's presence with the practiced neutrality of medical staff. When she left, Hill spoke again. They're saying it might be months before you guys get sent home. Transportation's all messed up. Half the Pacific Fleet is moving troops around. Means you'll be here a while longer. Months? Takeo repeated, the word heavy with implication. Months of this limbo, this strange existence between worlds. Months of 3 meals daily, clean bunks, and the suffocating kindness of captors who should have been cruel. Make the most of it, Hill suggested. Learn English, maybe. Pick up a trade. Whatever you do back in Japan, you're gonna need skills to rebuild. He gestured at his injured arm. And maybe teach more guys that first aid you know. Never know when it might save another life. As Yamamoto escorted Takeo back to the barracks, they passed the kitchen where preparation for breakfast was underway. Private Miller waved through the open door, his round face creased with morning cheerfulness. The simple gesture, acknowledging Takeo as a person rather than a prisoner, reinforced the cognitive dissonance that had become his constant companion. Back in the barracks, Hiroshi was waiting. What happened? We heard you were called to Morrison's office. Nothing happened, Takeo replied. He wanted me to see Hill, to accept his gratitude. Hiroshi studied him carefully. And did you accept it? Takeo sat on his bunk, exhausted despite the early hour. I don't know what I accepted. Everything is confused. I saved a man's life, and some say I'm a traitor. I acted on instinct, and now I'm called courageous. The words mean nothing anymore. Perhaps that's the point, Hiroshi suggested quietly. Perhaps we need to find new words for what we're becoming. August 25th, 1945, 1400 hours. Camp McCoy Kitchen. The afternoon heat made the kitchen almost unbearable, despite open windows and electric fans that pushed hot air in lazy circles. Takeo stood at the sink, elbows deep in soapy water, scrubbing pots while Private George Miller worked beside him, preparing vegetables for dinner. 2 weeks in the kitchen had established a comfortable rhythm between them. Miller talked while they worked, his Iowa accent growing familiar to Takeo's ears, even through Yamamoto's translations. Today, Miller was discussing his farm, describing his 320 acres with the passion of a man who genuinely loved the land. Corn, mostly, Miller explained, his knife moving efficiently through carrots. Some soybeans, hay for the livestock. Not a big operation, but it's honest work. My grandfather homesteaded that land in 1887. 3 generations of Millers have worked that soil. Takeo rinsed a large pot, considering the concept of generational connection to land. His own family had owned their furniture shop for only 15 years before the war consumed everything. Your children will take over when you return? Miller's knife paused. Got 3 kids, 2 boys and a girl. The boys, maybe. They're young still, 8 and 6. The girl's only 3. Hard to say what any of them will want. America's changing. Kids these days have choices we never had. Choices, Takeo repeated, the word feeling strange. In Japan, duty determined destiny. Sons followed fathers. Daughters married appropriately. Choice was luxury for the wealthy, or foolish. That bother you? Miller asked, reading something in Takeo's tone. The idea of children choosing their own paths? Through Yamamoto, Takeo struggled to articulate his thoughts. In Japan, we believe harmony comes from everyone knowing their place. If children choose freely, how does society function? Miller set down his knife, giving the question serious consideration. Well, I suppose we believe harmony comes from everyone having the freedom to find their own place. Sometimes they make mistakes, choose poorly, but they're their mistakes to make. He smiled. My pa wanted me to be a lawyer, sent me to college and everything, but I hated it, loved farming. So I came home, took over the land, and pa forgave me, eventually. The concept staggered Takeo. Defying parental expectations without shame. choosing personal preference over familial duty, seeking forgiveness rather than permission. These were not Japanese values. Yet Miller spoke of it casually, as if such freedom was natural rather than dangerous. "You think I'm wrong," Miller observed. "You think children should obey." "I think," Takeo said carefully, "that I no longer know what I think about many things." Miller laughed, a warm sound that filled the kitchen. "Son, that's the smartest thing I've heard anyone say all week. Man who's certain about everything probably hasn't thought things through." They worked in comfortable silence for several minutes, the routine tasks allowing Takeo's mind to wander. Through the window, he could see other prisoners in the recreation yard. Some played simple games with makeshift equipment. Others sat in small groups, talking, smoking cigarettes purchased from the canteen with their work wages. The scene could have been from any military camp anywhere, except these were prisoners who looked healthier than they had as soldiers. "Can I ask you something?" Miller said suddenly. "About Japan. About what you believed before you got captured." Takeo tensed slightly, but nodded. "Did you really believe Americans were devils? That we tortured prisoners and ate babies and all that propaganda nonsense?" The directness of the question demanded honest response. "Yes. Not all of it, perhaps, but enough. We were shown photographs, told stories by officers who claimed to have witnessed American atrocities. After years of hearing the same messages, they became truth." "But you don't believe that now," Miller stated rather than asked. "No. The evidence contradicts the propaganda. You feed us better than our own army did. You provide medicine, shelter, fair treatment. Either everything I was taught was lies, or you are the most skilled deceivers in history." Miller resumed chopping vegetables, his movements methodical. "I'll let you in on a secret. Most of us didn't want to be here either. I got drafted in '42, trained for 8 months, shipped to England, then here for guard duty. Never fired my rifle in anger, never killed anyone. Just cooked meals and followed orders." "You don't want to be a soldier," Takeo observed. "Hell no," Miller said emphatically. "Pardon my language, but no. I want to be home with my family, planting crops, living a quiet life. This uniform's just temporary. Soon as they let me, I'm going back to Iowa and never leaving again." The confession created unexpected kinship. Takeo had volunteered for military service, believing it his duty, but he had never wanted to be a soldier either. He wanted to build furniture like his father, create beautiful things from good wood, live simply and honorably. War had stolen that future, replacing it with killing and dying, and this strange captivity. "What will you do?" Miller asked, "when you go back to Japan?" "I don't know if there's anything to go back to. My city was bombed. My family, I don't know if they survived. The shop is certainly destroyed." Miller's expression softened with genuine sympathy. "That's rough, son, real rough. But you got skills. You're smart, hardworking, willing to learn. Those things matter more than buildings or businesses. Those can be rebuilt." "By who?" Takeo asked bitterly. "Japan is defeated. We have nothing. No industry, no resources, no pride." "You've got people," Miller countered. "And people can rebuild anything if they work together. Look at your hands. They're workers' hands. You can build, create, grow things. That's what matters after war's end." Before Takeo could respond, Sergeant Carter entered the kitchen, his presence immediately commanding attention despite his casual demeanor. "Miller, Need you to prepare extra rations for tomorrow. We're getting 30 more prisoners transferred from another camp. Takeo, you're doing good work. Keep it up. After Carter left, Miller turned to Takeo with a slight smile. See? More mouths to feed, more potatoes to peel. Welcome to peacetime military service. All the work, none of the glory. Despite himself, Takeo smiled back. The absurdity of finding humor in prison camp, of developing friendship with an enemy cook, of learning American values while scrubbing pots, it all felt surreal, yet somehow more real than anything he had experienced in years of war. As they finished the afternoon's work, Miller offered a final observation. You know what I think? I think maybe this war taught us all the wrong lessons. Taught us to hate, to kill, to destroy. Maybe now we need to learn the harder lessons. How to build, to forgive, to live alongside people who were enemies. Takeo considered this as he dried his hands on a towel. Those are much harder lessons. Yep, Miller agreed, but probably more important ones. August 28, 1945, 2200 hours. Camp McCoy Infirmary. The fever had come suddenly during afternoon work detail, transforming Takeo from functional prisoner to shivering invalid within hours. Now he lay on a clean white bed, his body alternating between chills and sweats, his mind drifting through fragmentary dreams of home, battle, and strange American kindness. Through the haze of illness, he became aware of cool hands on his forehead, a gentle voice speaking English he couldn't understand. When his eyes focused, he saw Corporal Ann Thompson, one of the camp's nurses, checking his temperature with a glass thermometer. She was perhaps 30 years old, her brown hair pulled back in a regulation bun, her expression professional, but kind. 103.5, she murmured to herself, making notes on his chart. Through his fever, Takeo understood the numbers meant his temperature was dangerously high. She disappeared briefly, returning with pills and water. Aspirin, she said slowly, holding up the tablets. For fever. Drink. She mimed the action, and Takeo complied weakly, the water feeling like salvation against his parched throat. Over the next 3 days, Takeo experienced the strangeness of being cared for by an enemy woman. Ann Thompson appeared every 4 hours like clockwork, checking his temperature, changing his sweat-soaked sheets, ensuring he drank enough fluids. She spoke to him constantly, even knowing he understood almost nothing, her voice a soothing presence in his delirium. On the second night, when fever dreams made him cry out in Japanese, she sat beside his bed, holding his hand until the nightmares passed. The gesture, maternal and comforting, broke through something in Takeo's consciousness. This American woman, whom propaganda had taught him to view as inferior and corrupt, showed him more tenderness than anyone had since his mother had died when he was 12. By the third day, the fever broke. Takeo woke clear-headed for the first time, finding Ann Thompson reading a book in the chair beside his bed. The morning sun illuminated her face, and he realized with shock that she had been beautiful all along, hidden behind his prejudice and propaganda-trained perceptions. "Feeling better?" she asked, then gestured to her own forehead and smiled, miming taking temperature. Takeo nodded weakly. "Yes, thank you." She understood the tone, if not the words, returning his nod with a pleased expression. Through gestures and simple words, they established basic communication. She brought him breakfast, solid food, for the first time in days. While he ate, she changed his bedding with efficient movements that spoke of years of practice. Corporal Yamamoto appeared during afternoon rounds, allowing proper conversation for the first time. "Miss Thompson wants to know if you're feeling strong enough for visitors.
Your friend Hiroshi has been asking about you daily. Yes, please, Takeo responded. When Hiroshi arrived, his relief was visible. We thought you might die. The fever was very high. Sergeant Carter said it was touch and go for a day. Miss Thompson took care of me, Takeo said, watching the nurse work with another patient across the room. She sat with me through the worst night. Hiroshi followed his gaze. She's known for that. The other prisoners who've been sick all say the same thing. She treats everyone the same, American or Japanese, with genuine care. The observation forced Takeo to confront another propaganda lie. American women were supposed to be weak, frivolous, concerned only with luxury and pleasure. Yet Ann Thompson worked 12-hour shifts in a military hospital, caring for enemy prisoners with the same dedication she showed American soldiers. Her strength, her competence, her compassion, all contradicted everything he had been taught about Western women. Over the next 2 days of recovery, Takeo observed Ann Thompson's routine. She moved between patients with practiced efficiency, her manner adapting to each person's needs. With the frightened young prisoners, she was maternal. With the angry or resistant ones, she was firm but fair. With those in pain, she was gentle. Every action demonstrated
professional skill and genuine humanity. On his final day in the infirmary, Ann Thompson brought him a tray with extra food, smiling as she set it down. Through Yamamoto, who happened to be present, she explained, "You need to rebuild your strength. Extra protein, extra calories, doctor's orders." Takeo bowed his head in gratitude. "Thank you for everything. For saving my life." When Yamamoto translated, Ann Thompson looked embarrassed. "I didn't save your life. Medicine did that. I just made sure you weren't alone while your body fought the infection." "That is saving a life," Takeo insisted. "To ensure someone is not alone in their darkest moments. That is profound kindness." Ann Thompson's eyes grew moist at the translation. She touched Takeo's shoulder briefly, a gesture of connection that transcended language and enemy status. "We're all human, all deserving of care when we're vulnerable. War shouldn't change that." As Takeo prepared to return to the barracks that afternoon, he found himself transformed in ways the fever hadn't caused. He had arrived at Camp McCoy expecting brutality. He had found abundance. He had expected hatred. He had found kindness. And now, through the care of an enemy woman, he had discovered something that shattered his final prejudices. The Americans weren't pretending to be compassionate. They weren't maintaining appearances for propaganda purposes. Their kindness was genuine, reflexive, part of their fundamental values. Ann Thompson hadn't cared for him to prove a point. She had cared for him because that's what nurses do. Because that's what decent people do. Because in her worldview, his humanity mattered regardless of his nationality. Walking back to the barracks with Hiroshi, Takeo struggled to articulate his revelation. Everything we were taught about Americans, about their women, about their society, all of it was lies. Yes, Hiroshi agreed quietly. But knowing something is a lie and accepting that you believed the lie, those are different things. The first is intellectual. The second is emotional. You're experiencing the second now. It feels like grief, Takeo admitted. Like mourning something I thought I knew. It is grief, Hiroshi confirmed. You're grieving for the certainty you once had, for the clear moral universe where we were righteous and they were evil. That universe is dead. Now we must learn to live in a more complicated one. That night, lying in his bunk, Takeo thought about Ann Thompson sitting beside his bed during his fever dreams, holding his hand through his nightmares. He thought about her competence, her strength, her refusal to see him as less than human despite his enemy status. He thought about everything he had believed about women, about Americans, about the nature of civilization itself. All of it was ash now, burned away by the fever of reality confronting propaganda. In its place, something new was growing. Understanding, perhaps, or simply the recognition that the world was far more nuanced than his training had suggested. The enemy had faces, names, families, dreams. They were not monsters. They were frighteningly, undeniably human. And if they were human, if their kindness was genuine, then what did that make him? A soldier who had fought for lies? A victim of propaganda? Or simply another human being trying to make sense of an insane world? Takeo didn't have answers, but for the first time since his capture, he believed that finding answers might be possible. The fever had burned away more than illness. It had burned away the last remnants of certainty that had sustained him through war. What remained was raw, painful, and terrifyingly free. September 1st, 1945, 1900 hours, Camp McCoy Barracks. The late summer evening brought cooler air through the barracks windows, a relief after the day's heat. Takeo sat on his bunk with Hiroshi, sharing cigarettes purchased from the canteen with their work wages. Around them, other prisoners engaged in quiet activities, reading, writing letters to families they weren't sure still existed, playing simple games to pass the endless hours. "I received a letter from the Red Cross today," Hiroshi said, his voice carefully neutral. "My wife and children survived the bombing of Tokyo. They are living with her parents in the countryside, hungry but alive." The news should have brought joy, but Hiroshi's expression remained troubled. Takeo understood why. Every letter from home reinforced the cognitive dissonance of their situation. Their families starved while they ate 3 full meals daily. Their cities lay in ruins while they lived in clean barracks with electric lights and running water. The survivors suffered while the captured thrived. "The guilt is worse than the shame of capture," Takeo observed quietly. "At least shame is about honor, about facing ancestors. Guilt is about the living, about people suffering while we are comfortable." Hiroshi nodded slowly. "My wife wrote that she is proud I survived, that she dreams of my return. But how can I return to her? I am a different man now. The man she married believed in the emperor's divinity, in Japanese superiority, in the righteousness of our cause. That man is dead." "What man are you now?" Takeo asked. "I don't know yet. Someone who has seen that the enemy possesses more humanity than we were taught. Someone who understands that our government lied about everything that mattered. Someone who wants peace more than honor." The conversation was treasonous by old standards, but those standards no longer applied. The emperor himself had surrendered, had admitted defeat, had revealed his mortality by choosing survival over glorious destruction. If the living God could abandon the old certainties, what right did ordinary soldiers have to cling to them? Through the window, they could see American soldiers ending their duty shifts,
laughing and joking as they headed toward their own barracks.
The contrast with Japanese military discipline remained jarring, even after weeks of observation. American soldiers seemed to view military service as temporary inconvenience rather than sacred duty. They obeyed orders but maintained individual personalities, questioned decisions, expressed opinions. Such behavior would have meant severe punishment in the Imperial Army. "Do you think we can learn to be like them?" Hiroshi asked. "To question authority, to think for ourselves, to value individual choice?" "I think we have to," Takeo replied. "The old way led to this, to defeat, to occupation, to starvation. Perhaps the American way, with all its chaos and inefficiency, somehow works better." Corporal Yamamoto entered the barracks, accompanied by Sergeant Carter. The presence of command personnel brought automatic silence and attention from the prisoners. Carter surveyed the room before speaking, his words translated by Yamamoto. "Gentlemen, I have news about repatriation. The process is beginning, but it will take months. Transportation is limited. Priorities favor the sick and wounded first. Able-bodied prisoners will likely remain here until spring of next year at earliest." The announcement created visible reactions. Some prisoners looked relieved at the delay, others distressed by the extended captivity. Takeo found himself experiencing both emotions simultaneously, wanting to go home, yet dreading what home had become. Carter continued. "In the meantime, we're expanding work programs. Those interested can learn trades, carpentry, mechanics, farming techniques. The skills might prove useful when you return to Japan." He paused. "We're also starting English classes for those who want to learn. No pressure, no requirement, just an opportunity." After Carter left, the barracks erupted in discussion. The conservative prisoners, led by the veteran who had accused Takeo of collaboration, denounced the programs as corruption, attempts to turn them into American sympathizers. Others, including Hiroshi, saw practical value in acquiring new skills. "English could be useful," Hiroshi argued to the group. "If Americans are occupying Japan, knowing their language means better opportunities for work, for protecting our families." "Or it means collaboration," the veteran spat. "Learning the enemy's tongue, adopting their ways. You're forgetting who you are, forgetting your duty." Takeo found himself standing, surprising himself with his anger. "Our duty was to die for the Emperor. The Emperor chose life instead. He surrendered. He admitted we were wrong. What duty do we have now except to survive and help rebuild what we destroyed?" The veteran stepped forward threateningly. "You're a traitor. You saved an American soldier's life. You work happily in their kitchen. You accept their propaganda about freedom and democracy. You've forgotten Japan." "I haven't forgotten Japan," Takeo countered. "I've remembered what Japan was supposed to be before militarists destroyed it. My father was a craftsman who took pride in creating beautiful things. My mother taught school, educated children. They believed in building, not destroying. The Japan I remember wasn't about war and conquest. It was about craft, honor, and community." "That Japan was weak," the veteran insisted. "We became strong through military discipline." "We became ashes through military discipline," Hiroshi interjected. "Look at the evidence. America fed its prisoners better than we fed our soldiers. American nurses cared for enemy wounded while our civilians starved. American soldiers go home to families while ours died in meaningless last stands. Which system actually served its people better?" The argument continued for hours, dividing the barracks into factions. Some clung desperately to old certainties, viewing any acceptance of American values as betrayal. Others, like Takeo and Hiroshi, recognized that survival required adaptation, that rebuilding Japan would demand new approaches. Late that night, after the arguments had exhausted themselves and most prisoners slept, Takeo lay awake, processing everything. The propaganda hadn't just lied about American cruelty. It had lied about Japanese superiority, about the inevitability of victory, about the righteousness of their cause. Every certainty he had built his identity upon had proven false. But propaganda served a purpose. It simplified complex reality into manageable narratives. It provided clear enemies and righteous causes. It made dying easier by promising glory and honor. Without propaganda's comforting lies, soldiers faced the terrifying truth. War was chaos. Death was random. And most causes were less righteous than claimed. The American soldiers Takeo had observed seemed to understand this instinctively. They fought not for ideology, but for each other, for home, for the practical goal of ending the war and returning to normal life. They didn't claim moral superiority or racial destiny. They simply wanted to win and go home. This modest goal, so different from Japanese rhetoric about divine mission and eternal glory, had somehow proven more sustainable. Hiroshi's quiet voice came from the darkness. "Are you awake?" "Yes." "I've been thinking about my wife's letter. She wrote that the Americans occupying Tokyo are not as terrible as expected. Some are kind. Some share their rations with hungry children. She said her neighbor's daughter is learning English from an American soldier who gives her chocolate for every new word learned." "Does that comfort you or disturb you?" Takeo asked. "Both," Hiroshi admitted. "It means my family is safe, which comforts me. But it means they're learning to accommodate the conquerors, which should disturb me but somehow doesn't. I think I've lost the ability to hate Americans. I've seen too much evidence that they're just people." "Perhaps that's the most dangerous thing we've learned here," Takeo suggested. "Not that Americans are good and we were bad, but that good and bad don't apply to entire peoples. Individuals are kind or cruel, wise or foolish, compassionate or hateful. Nations are just collections of individuals, too large and complex for simple moral judgments." "When did you become a philosopher?" Hiroshi asked with gentle humor. "When my certainties died and left only questions." September 5th, 1945, 1300 hours. Camp McCoy, Administrative Building. Takeo stood at attention before Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, flanked by Sergeant Watkins and the veteran prisoner who had accused him of collaboration. The formal atmosphere made clear this was not a casual conversation. Morrison's expression was grave as he read from a report. "Private Nishida, you stand accused by fellow prisoner Sergeant Kenji Matsuda of fraternization with the enemy, collaboration, and behavior unbecoming a Japanese soldier. Sergeant Matsuda claims you have forgotten your duty to Japan and Emperor, that you work willingly for Americans, that you saved an enemy soldier's life, and that you encourage other prisoners to accept American values." Through Yamamoto's translation, Takeo heard each charge, feeling the weight of them accumulate. In Japanese military justice, such accusations would mean severe punishment, possibly execution. Here, in American captivity, he didn't know what to expect. "Sergeant Matsuda requests that you be segregated from other prisoners to prevent further corruption of morale," Morrison continued. "He suggests hard labor and restricted privileges as appropriate punishment." The colonel set down the paper and looked directly at Takeo. "Under the Geneva Convention, I cannot punish you for actions that don't violate camp regulations. Saving Private Hill's life wasn't a violation. Working in the kitchen isn't collaboration. Learning English, if you choose to, wouldn't be corruption. However, camp harmony matters. Discord among prisoners creates security issues. Morrison paused, considering his words carefully. Here's my decision. You will be transferred to a different barracks, separated from Sergeant Matsuda and his supporters. This is not punishment, but practical management. You may continue kitchen duties if you choose. However, I'm ordering you to keep lower profile, avoid confrontations, and let this tension dissipate naturally. The decision felt simultaneously like vindication and defeat. Takeo wasn't being punished for his transformation, but he was being isolated from the community that should have been his support. The practical American solution recognized that sometimes separation served better than confrontation, but it also meant acknowledging that division among the prisoners was now permanent. After dismissal, Takeo gathered his few possessions and moved to Barracks 3, where Hiroshi and other moderate prisoners were housed. The physical relocation took 15 minutes. The emotional impact would last much longer. That evening, sitting on his new bunk in an unfamiliar space, Takeo felt the full weight of his isolation. He had been separated from fellow prisoners by his transformation. He could never truly join the Americans because he remained their prisoner and former enemy. He existed in limbo between worlds, belonging fully to neither. Private Miller found him during dinner preparation, noting his absence from the usual workstation. Through Yamamoto, Miller learned about the transfer and its implications. That's rough, Miller sympathized. Being caught between groups, not fitting anywhere. I understand that feeling more than you might think. How could you understand? Takeo asked, not accusingly, but genuinely curious. Miller glanced around to ensure privacy before responding. My wife is Catholic. I'm Methodist. Back in Iowa, that matters to some folks. Her family didn't approve of our marriage. My family had doubts. We caught grief from both sides for years. Eventually, we realized we didn't need everyone's approval. We just needed each other and a few good friends. The parallel wasn't exact, but Takeo grasped the essential truth. Transformation required leaving some people behind, accepting that not everyone would understand or approve. Growth meant outgrowing old certainties and the communities built around them. What did you do? Takeo asked. To deal with the isolation. Focused on what mattered. My farm, my family, building something good. Eventually, people came around, or they didn't. Either way, I lived my life according to my values, not their expectations. The advice was simple, practical, very American in its focus on individual choice over social harmony. It contradicted everything Japanese culture taught about subordinating personal desires to group consensus. Yet here, in this strange liminal space between worlds, perhaps American individualism offered a path forward. That night, Takeo wrote his first letter home, using paper and pencil provided by camp authorities. He didn't know if his family had survived, didn't know if the letter would reach them, but the act of writing itself brought clarity. Dear Father, he began through careful characters. I am alive and healthy, held in an American prisoner of war camp in Wisconsin. The Americans treat us well, better than our own army did during the final months of fighting. I have learned many things about our former enemies that contradict what we were taught. He paused, considering how much truth to share. Too much might bring shame on his family. Too little would be dishonest. Finally, he continued. I have learned that Americans are not devils or barbarians. They are people like us, with families and dreams and fears. I have learned that our propaganda lied about many things. Most importantly, I have learned that surviving the war does not mean we failed in our duty. The emperor himself chose survival over destruction. Perhaps we honor our ancestors better by living well than by dying pointlessly. The letter continued for several pages, describing the camp, his work, his gradual transformation. He didn't mention saving Private Hill, didn't detail the accusations against him, but he was honest about his changing perspective. When finished, he felt simultaneously lighter and more burdened. Lighter because he had articulated his transformation. Burdened because he knew these words might bring shame or concern to whatever remained of his family. Hiroshi, reading on the adjacent bunk, looked up when Takeo sealed the letter. "Did you tell them the truth?" "As much truth as I could without causing unnecessary pain." "That's all any of us can do now. Tell our truth, accept the consequences, and hope understanding follows eventually." The barracks lights dimmed for evening, leaving only emergency lighting. Takeo lay in darkness, listening to the sounds of 60 men settling into sleep. Snores, whispered conversations, the creak of bunk frames, the distant footsteps of guards making rounds. These sounds had become familiar, almost comforting in their routine. Tomorrow he would return to kitchen duties, would peel potatoes alongside Miller, would continue his gradual transformation from soldier to something new. The accusations would remain. The division among prisoners would persist. But he had made his choice. Forward, not back. Growth, not stagnation. Truth, however painful, over comfortable lies. The setback wasn't punishment. It was test. And in accepting his isolation, in choosing honesty over conformity, Takeo had perhaps passed the most important test of all. He had chosen to become himself, rather than remain what others expected him to be. In that choice lay both liberation and loneliness, freedom and exile. But it was his choice, and that, he was learning, made all the difference. September 7th, 1945, 0900 hours. Camp McCoy Recreation Yard. Takeo sat alone on a bench, watching morning sun burn off the dew from Wisconsin grass. 2 days had passed since his transfer to Barracks 3. 2 days of processing his isolation, his transformation, his uncertain future. The questions that had consumed him since capture were crystallizing into something approaching clarity. Sergeant James Carter approached across the yard, his stride purposeful but unhurried. He carried 2 cups of coffee, steam rising in the cool morning air. Without asking permission, he sat beside Takeo and offered 1 cup. "Thought you might need this," Carter said through Corporal Yamamoto, who had followed at a discreet distance. "Heard about the accusations, the transfer. Rough week for you." Takeo accepted the coffee, its warmth spreading through his hands. "I don't regret helping Private Hill. Even knowing the consequences, I would make the same choice." Carter nodded slowly, sipping his own coffee. "That's good. That's growth. When doing the right thing becomes more important than avoiding consequences, that's when a man discovers who he really is." They sat in comfortable silence, 2 soldiers who had been enemies watching the same sun rise over the same land. Finally, Carter spoke again, his voice carrying weight beyond the simple words. "I've been thinking about your question, the one you asked in the kitchen, about making children, about having a future. You asked if you could try too." Carter smiled slightly. "The answer is yes. Not just yes, but you should. You must. Men like you and me, we survived this war. We have an obligation to the ones who didn't. We have to build the peace they died for." Through Yamamoto's translation, Takeo felt the full impact of those words. An obligation not to the past, but to the future. Not to the dead's revenge, but to the living's hope. "I'm afraid," Takeo admitted, surprising himself with the honesty. "Afraid to go home to a Japan I don't recognize. Afraid to stay in America, where I'll always be former enemy. Afraid that everything I learned here means nothing outside these fences." Carter set down his coffee cup, his expression serious but kind. "Fear's natural. I'm afraid too. Afraid to go back to Alabama, where my skin color matters more than my service. Afraid my kids will grow up in a world that judges them before knowing them. But fear can't stop us from trying. We owe it to ourselves and to each other." The conversation shifted something fundamental in Takeo's understanding. His transformation wasn't betrayal of Japan. It was evolution towards something larger than nationalism or propaganda. It was becoming fully human, capable of recognizing humanity in everyone, regardless of uniform or flag or race. "What would you do?" Takeo asked. "If you were me, facing repatriation to a destroyed homeland?" Carter considered carefully before responding. "I'd ask myself where I could do the most good, where my experience, my transformation, my understanding could help heal what war broke. Maybe that's Japan. Maybe it's here. Maybe it's somewhere else entirely. But wherever it is, it's where you're needed most." Over the following months, as autumn turned to winter and winter approached spring, Takeo found his answer. Letters from Japan painted pictures of devastation, but also resilience. His father had survived, though the furniture shop was ashes. His sister lived with relatives in the countryside. They wanted him home, but understood if he chose differently. Meanwhile, in Camp McCoy, Takeo became informal liaison between prisoners and administration. His English improved daily through classes and conversations. He helped translate, mediate disputes, explain cultural differences that caused misunderstandings. He discovered talent for bridge building, for finding common ground between people who should have been enemies. When repatriation began in spring of 1946, Takeo made his choice. He would stay in America, at least temporarily, to work with organizations helping Japanese Americans return from internment camps to rebuild their lives. Later, he would return to Japan as part of reconstruction efforts, carrying knowledge of American methods and democratic values. Eventually, he would spend his life moving between countries, building understanding, translating not just words, but worldviews. Private Hill, fully recovered, attended Takeo's farewell gathering before his transfer to civilian status. They shook hands, no longer prisoner and guard, but simply two men who had survived war and chosen peace. "Thank you," Hill said simply, "for saving my life, for teaching me that enemies can become friends." "Thank you," Takeo replied in careful English, "for showing me that future is possible, that men can change, that kindness is stronger than hate." Sergeant Carter's final words to Takeo carried the weight of prophecy. "You asked if you could try too, if you could have children and family and future like us. You can. You will. And when you do, you'll teach them what you learned here. That humanity transcends borders, that compassion defeats propaganda, that the bravest thing any soldier can do is choose peace." Years later, Takeo would stand before audiences in both America and Japan, telling his story of transformation. He would speak of the question that changed his life, the innocent curiosity that opened doors to profound understanding. He would explain how discovering that black soldiers made children with love, hope, and dreams of future had revealed the fundamental lie of all propaganda: that any group of people was less than human. His story became testimony to the power of kindness to transform enemies into friends, of compassion to heal wounds deeper than any weapon could inflict. The question that had once seemed naive revealed itself as profound wisdom. Could he try too? Could he have future, family, hope? Yes. Always yes. That was the answer America had given him, the gift that transcended victory and defeat, the recognition that every person deserves a future, regardless of past, regardless of uniform, regardless of which side of history they stood on. Takeo Nishida had arrived at Camp McCoy as a defeated enemy soldier expecting death. He departed as a man reborn, carrying seeds of reconciliation that would grow into forests of understanding. His transformation proved that the greatest victories aren't won on battlefields, but in human hearts choosing peace over vengeance, hope over despair, future over past. The war had ended. The healing had begun. And it started with a simple question about making children, about having futures, about being human together, despite everything that had divided them. That question, and its answer, changed everything. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.